You have almost certainly been given bad advice about a used car. Not malicious advice, not dishonest advice, just advice that was passed down from someone who heard it from someone else, who read it in a magazine in 1989, who was reacting to a problem that the manufacturer had already quietly fixed by 1991. That is how car reputations work. They outlive their cause, they outlive their accuracy, and sometimes they outlive the cars themselves. The 5 cars in this video have all been on the receiving end of that process for decades. One of them was killed by a book. One of them won the hardest race on earth. One of them was chosen by a television show to represent personal failure without a single line of dialogue. All 5 of them are, by any honest reading of the data, significantly more reliable than the reputation that surrounds them. You probably own one of them. You probably know someone who owns another one. And you have almost certainly heard bad things about all 5. Here is what the data actually says. Car number 1, the Chevrolet Corvair. If you are over 50 and you hear the word Corvair, you probably think of one man and one book. Ralph Nader, unsafe at any speed, the car that rolls over, the car that killed people, the car that a young consumer advocate almost single-handedly destroyed through the power of investigative writing. That is the version almost everyone knows. It is also substantially wrong. The man behind the Corvair was named Ed Cole, and he was not a corporate executive playing it safe with a conventional product. Cole was an engineer's engineer who had been appointed chief engineer of Chevrolet in 1952, promoted to general manager 4 years later, and who would eventually become president of General Motors itself. Before any of that, he was the lead engineer on the Chevrolet small block V8, introduced for 1955. Which is the engine that went on to power almost every American performance car of the next 4 decades. Cole's interest in rear-mounted air-cooled engines did not come from watching Volkswagen Beetles on American streets. It came from the Second World War, where Cole spent his time as the chief design engineer on light tanks and combat vehicles for Cadillac. He designed the powertrains for the M24 Chaffee and the M5 Stuart tanks, and the M5 used 2 rear-mounted Cadillac V8s driving through hydromatic transmissions. Ed Cole had been thinking about rear-engine architecture since before most Americans had even learned to drive. And here is the part almost nobody tells you about the Corvair's development. When Cole was building the prototype internally, he was genuinely afraid that General Motors senior management would kill the project before he could finish it. So, he disguised the entire program inside his own company. He told the paperwork that the rear-engine prototype was actually a development project for Holden, which was General Motors' Australian subsidiary at the time. He assigned Holden part numbers to Corvair components. He used Holden stationery on official documents, and he routed purchase orders through Holden accounts. Ed Cole smuggled the Corvair through his own company by pretending it was an Australian car. When he finally presented the finished prototype to Harlow Curtis, the president of General Motors at the time, Curtis drove the car around the proving grounds and said the line that got the Corvair approved for production. In his own words, he simply said, "I think you've got something there, Ed." The car was greenlit in 1957 and went on sale in the autumn of 1959 as a 1960 model. Now look at what Ed Cole actually put into production against the wishes of half his own company. The Corvair had an aluminum block air-cooled flat-6 engine at a time when no American car maker was mass-producing aluminum engine blocks. The engine, transmission, and differential were combined into a single integrated rear unit that Chevrolet called the Unipack. The car used all-independent suspension, when most of its American competitors were still using solid rear axles. It used unibody construction when most of its competitors were still on body-on-frame chassis. And the passenger compartment had a nearly flat floor because there was no driveshaft tunnel running down the center of the car. Motor Trend named it Car of the Year for 1960. Ed Cole and the Corvair landed together on the cover of Time magazine. In the first 2 days of sales alone, Chevrolet moved nearly 26,000 of them. Across 10 years of production, Chevrolet sold roughly 1.8 million Corvairs in an astonishing range of body styles, including a 2-door coupe, a 4-door sedan, a wagon called the Lakewood, a van called the Greenbrier, and a pickup called the Rampside, which had a drop-down side gate that let you load cargo from the side of the bed instead of the back. The ramp side was 20 years ahead of its time, and you can still occasionally see one at vintage truck shows, drawing crowds who cannot believe Chevrolet actually built it. The air-cooled flat-six engine went far beyond the Corvair itself. NASA used Corvair-powered mobile laboratories to train Apollo astronauts in the New Mexico desert, preparing them for lunar rover operations. An entire cottage industry of home-built aircraft enthusiasts modified Corvair engines for use in small planes, because the engine was light, air-cooled, and fundamentally over-engineered for automotive duty in the first place. The Corvair was also one of the direct architectural inspirations for the original Porsche 911, which meant the flat-six rear engine layout that would define the 911 for 60 years was being mass-produced in a Chevrolet plant in Willow Run, Michigan, 7 full years before the 911 existed as a production car. This is the vehicle Ralph Nader called the one-car accident. Now, the handling issue Nader attacked was real. It was not invented out of thin air, but it was also much smaller than the book made it sound. And it was made worse by two very specific corporate decisions that Chevrolet was quietly already reversing by the time the book went to print. The 1960 through 1963 Corvair used a swing-axle rear suspension, which meant that under aggressive cornering, the rear wheels could tuck under the car and the vehicle could roll. The Corvair also required tire pressures that were noticeably different from industry norms at the time, with roughly 15 psi at the front and 26 at the rear. Chevrolet printed the correct pressures in the owner's manual and on the door placard, but dealers and owners routinely filled the tires to whatever felt right to them, and at the wrong pressures, the car understeered aggressively at low speeds and oversteered aggressively at high speeds. That caused accidents, and those accidents became lawsuits, and most of those lawsuits were already settled years before Nader's book was ever published. Then there is the decision that still makes Corvair owners angry to this day. Just before production started, in order to save approximately $15 per car, General Motors deleted the front sway bar from the Corvair's suspension design. A front sway bar would have significantly reduced the oversteer tendency that caused most of the rollover accidents. Owners who add a front sway bar today, which is one of the most common modifications in the Corvair community, consistently report that the car handles predictably and safely. $15 per car. General Motors saved that amount and then paid hundreds of millions in legal costs, killed an entire model line, and helped create the modern American consumer safety movement because of the consequences. And here is the cruelest irony in the entire story. Chevrolet redesigned the Corvair's suspension for the 1965 model year, replacing the swing axle entirely with a fully independent rear suspension design. Road and Track magazine wrote at the time that the new Corvair was one of the best handling American cars ever built. Ralph Nader's book came out in November of 1965, after the redesigned cars were already sitting on dealer showroom floors. The book attacked a suspension design that General Motors had already engineered out of the vehicle. Then, in July of 1972, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration finally released the results of a 2-year investigation that included handling tests conducted by Texas A&M University. The NHTSA tested the 1960 through 1963 Corvair directly against 4 contemporary compact cars from the same era. The finding was unambiguous. The Corvair showed no greater tendency toward loss of control and extreme maneuvers than anything else sold in its class during that period. Ralph Nader called the study rigged. The NHTSA's findings stood anyway. And there is one more piece of this story that almost nobody ever tells. While Nader was writing his book, General Motors hired private investigators to follow him, dig into his personal life, and try to find dirt that would discredit his work before it was published. The investigators were eventually discovered, and Nader sued General Motors for invasion of privacy. He won the case, and the settlement money funded the rest of his consumer advocacy career for the next 50 years. In a very real way, the Corvair created Ralph Nader more than Nader ever destroyed the Corvair. He only owned one car in his entire life, incidentally, and it was not a Corvair. It was a 1949 Studebaker that he drove to law school. On the reliability side of things, the Corvair's air-cooled flat six is remarkably durable even by modern standards. There is no water pump to fail, no radiator to corrode, And no head gasket failures because there are no conventional cylinder heads in the first place. Corvair forums routinely document cars that have crossed 200,000 miles on original internals. And for context, an average early 1960s American V8 was usually completely worn out by 120,000 miles. The Corvair engine was ahead of its time mechanically, just as the car itself was ahead of its time visually. And the only thing that kept it from being recognized as one of the great American compacts of the 20th century was a best-selling book that attacked a problem the engineers had already solved. Car number 2. The Mazda RX-7. The Mazda RX-7 is the car that the internet uses as its favorite cautionary tale. The rotary engine cannot be trusted. Apex seals always fail. If you buy one, you need to budget for a rebuild within 60,000 miles. Nobody can work on them. Parts are rare, the engineering is exotic, and the practical ownership experience is a slow financial bankruptcy. This reputation is so entrenched in enthusiast culture that it has become a meme you can find on any car forum within about 10 seconds of searching. Now, listen to what actually happened on a racetrack in France in June of 1991. At the 24 Hours of Le Mans that year, a Mazda prototype called the 787B lined up in 23rd position on the grid. It was not supposed to win. It was not even running in the primary engine category for the race. The FIA had just passed rules declaring that beginning in 1992, all prototype sports cars at Le Mans had to run 3.5-liter piston engines, which meant that rotary engines were explicitly banned from every future running of the event. 1991 was the last race that a rotary-powered car would ever be allowed to enter. The Mazda was running the 4-rotor R26B engine, which displaced 2.6 liters across 4 rotors instead of cylinders, produced roughly 700 horsepower at peak output, and was designed to operate continuously above 9,000 RPM for 24 consecutive hours. The engineering details of the R26B are worth pausing on because they are genuinely remarkable. The engine used 3 spark plugs per rotor, which meant 12 spark plugs in total across the full 4-rotor configuration. It used continuously variable telescopic intake runners that slid smoothly from long to short as the revs climbed, which preserved mid-range torque in a way that rotary engines had never previously managed. It used peripheral intake ports instead of the conventional side ports found on road-going rotaries, which dramatically increased airflow at high RPM. And it used ceramic apex seals rather than steel ones, because no metal seal could possibly survive 24 hours at 9,000 RPM without melting. The Jaguars at Le Mans that day had V12 engines. The Mercedes cars had twin-turbo V8s. The Peugeots were running the new 3.5-liter naturally aspirated engines built to the upcoming rules. Everyone at the track knew the Japanese team was the underdog going into the race. Here is what actually happened over the next 24 hours. The Mazda started from 23rd position on the grid and worked its way steadily into the top 10 by 6 in the evening on Saturday. By the halfway point of the race at 4 in the morning, it was running in the 3rd place. Not because the Mazda was faster than the leaders, it was not, but because it was not braking. The Mercedes, Jaguar, and Porsche teams all had to throttle their engines down significantly to survive the full distance of the race, because the 24 Hours of Le Mans is won on reliability as much as on outright pace, and every single front-running team had to back off their cars to make it to the finish. The Mazda did not. The R26B ran flat out, at full throttle for the entire duration of the race. With 3 hours left to go, the leading Mercedes suffered an engine failure and retired from the race. The Mazda inherited the lead, and it crossed the finish line first overall. Now look at the pit stop log from that race. Over 24 hours and 362 laps of the full Le Mans circuit, the winning Mazda made 28 pit stops. Across all of them combined, the total service the car received outside of routine fuel and tires was this: 1 oil top-up, 1 change of brake discs and pads, 1 nose change. That is the complete mechanical maintenance required by a 700 horsepower engine running at 9,000 RPM for 24 consecutive hours of race conditions. The 787B is the only rotary-powered car ever to win Le Mans. It is also the first Japanese car ever to win Le Mans outright in any category. And because of the rules ban that took effect the following year, it is the last rotary that will ever be allowed to win Le Mans in the history of the race. The driver lineup that day was a team of 3 Formula One drivers: Johnny Herbert, Volker Weidler, and Bertrand Gachot. Johnny Herbert was so physically exhausted after his final stint behind the wheel that he collapsed in the pit garage and missed the podium celebration ceremony entirely. Mazda, remarkably, did almost no marketing around the Le Mans win in the immediate aftermath of the race, because company executives were worried that celebrating a rotary victory in the same year the engine had just been banned from the series would look like sour grapes to the European racing establishment. The 787B was returned quietly to Hiroshima, and it sat in a warehouse for years before Mazda began publicly displaying it at motorsport events. This is the engine the internet tells you cannot be trusted. Now, the reputation for unreliability did not come from nowhere. It came from somewhere real. The rotary engine was invented by a German engineer named Felix Wankel, who filed his first patent for the design in 1929 and finally watched a working prototype run at the NSU research facility in February of 1957. That original prototype produced 29 horsepower at 17,000 RPM from just 125 cc of displacement. NSU brought the first production rotary car to market in 1964, which was a small sports car called the Spider. The follow-up to the Spider was a luxury sedan called the Row 80, which had severe apex seal wear problems from day one, which triggered massive warranty claims, which effectively bankrupted NSU as an independent company. Volkswagen bought what was left of NSU in 1969, and the Wankel engine's career in Germany ended in financial ruin. Mazda had signed a licensing contract with NSU back in 1961. The president of Mazda at the time, a man named Tsuneji Matsuda, genuinely believed that the rotary engine was the future of automotive engineering, and Mazda set up its own rotary engine research department in 1963 to pursue the technology seriously. The engineers who worked on the program came to be called the 47 Samurai inside Mazda, after the classical Japanese story about loyalty and dedication in the face of impossible odds. The 47 Samurai solved the apex seal problem that NSU never could, and Mazda's rotary engines went on to run 300 hours of continuous high-speed testing without a single failure. The first Mazda rotary car, the Cosmo 110S, went on sale in 1967. So why does the unreliability reputation persist to this day, despite all of that history? There are 2 reasons. The first is that rotary engines are uniquely unforgiving of owner neglect. Oil changes matter more on a rotary than on a piston engine. Warm-up procedures matter more. Running the engine at full throttle before it reaches full operating temperature will destroy it quickly. A lazy owner can permanently hurt a rotary in ways that a piston engine would never even notice. The second reason is that the RX-7 FD, which was the 3rd generation of the car built from 1992 through 2002, had a fiendishly complex twin sequential turbocharger system, fed by dozens of vacuum lines routed across the entire engine bay. As those vacuum lines aged and cracked over time, the car ran poorly. The engine management became erratic and unreliable, and owners who did not understand the system assumed that the rotary engine itself was broken. The engine was usually fine. The vacuum system was not. On actual reliability, Hagerty has stated publicly that a properly maintained 13B rotary engine can run past 150,000 miles without major work. Owner forms document cars at 160,000, at 190,000, and at 245,000 miles on the original engine. One well-documented owner crossed 320,000 miles on a 1979 RX-7 without ever once rebuilding the rotary. Compare that to the cars the enthusiast community considers absolutely untouchable on reliability. A Honda S2000 from the same era can cross 300,000 miles on an original engine without major work. The RX-7 can absolutely do the same, provided the owner knows what they are doing behind the wheel. The difference is simply that the Honda will forgive your mistakes, and the RX-7 will not. Car number 3, the Pontiac Aztek. The Pontiac Aztek went on sale in 2001, and within 12 months it was already appearing on worst cars ever lists in every major automotive publication. Within 5 years, it was being openly cited as the car that killed Pontiac as a serious performance brand. It is, to this day, the only vehicle in modern American automotive history that functions as a cultural shorthand for personal failure in popular culture. When Vince Gilligan and casting director Dennis Milliken were choosing the car that Walter White would drive at the start of Breaking Bad, they specifically wanted a vehicle that could communicate the defeat of a man with unrealized potential without requiring a single line of dialogue to do it. They looked at several different options during pre-production. The Aztek won the role because, in their own words, it was simply the most perfectly uncool vehicle available to cast. The show's art department then had the Aztek repainted in a specific gray, beige, green tone that would not match any factory paint color General Motors had ever offered, because they wanted the car to look visibly tired, even by the already low visual standards of the vehicle itself. Walter White drives that Aztek for 4 full seasons of the show. When he finally trades it in, he replaces it with a Chrysler 300 SRT8, and the car trade becomes the visual shorthand for the character's complete transformation from mild-mannered chemistry teacher into full-blown drug kingpin. The Aztek even functions as a plot device on the show in multiple episodes, with Walter's windshield being broken 3 separate times across the run, including one memorable incident involving debris from a mid-air plane collision. That is how deep the Aztek's cultural reputation runs, as a symbol of failure on a show that has become required viewing for an entire generation of American men. Now, here's what most people do not know about the actual origin of the vehicle. The Aztek was originally designed to be a genuinely revolutionary piece of product design. The design was led inside Pontiac by a man named Tom Peters, who was the same designer who would go on to create the Chevrolet Corvette C7 a full decade later. The original Aztek concept that Peters developed was aggressive and muscular. It sat low to the ground, it had defined shoulders, an athletic stance, and genuine surface tension across its entire body. The concept car that Pontiac showed at the 1999 North American International Auto Show received strong responses from exactly the demographic Pontiac was actively targeting with the program. Then General Motors put the production program through its internal corporate review process, and the Aztek was systematically disassembled. To save costs, the production Aztek was forced onto the existing platform of the Pontiac Montana minivan. That single decision raised the ride height, lengthened the wheelbase, and completely destroyed the athletic proportions of the concept car that had excited the auto show crowd. To meet a design review committee's demand for additional ground clearance, the plastic body cladding was added around the entire lower body of the vehicle, which gave it the cartoonish, ruggedized appearance people mocked for the next 2 decades. To meet packaging requirements carried over directly from the minivan platform, the upper body was made taller and more upright than the concept had been. By the time the production Aztek finally emerged from the full review process, it shared almost none of the proportions of the concept that had generated genuine excitement at the auto show. The people who worked on the original concept at Pontiac have spoken publicly in the years since about watching the vehicle become something they did not recognize anymore. Tom Peters eventually went on to Chevrolet, where he helped design some of the most admired American sports cars of the following decade, including the 7th generation Corvette. The Aztek, by his own account, was the car that taught him exactly what a design review committee could do to destroy his work if he was not careful. The Aztek was also, incidentally, one of the very first production vehicles at General Motors, designed entirely using computer-aided 3-dimensional modeling with no traditional clay model or hand-sculpted prototype in the loop. The final product is widely cited inside the GM design community as a cautionary tale about the limits of pure digital design without physical sculptural review. Now take the Aztek's original concept at face value for a moment, and look at what it was actually trying to do as a vehicle. The Aztek had a cooler built directly into the center console between the front seats. It had a tent attachment that could be installed out of the back hatch to turn the vehicle into a weekend camping base. It had removable plastic storage containers integrated into the cargo bay floor. It had a sliding cargo tray. Its rear seats could be folded, fully removed, or reconfigured to accommodate a full-size mattress for overnight camping. General Motors marketed the Aztek very deliberately at what it called the active lifestyle customer, which was people in their 30s who rode mountain bikes on weekends, went camping regularly, drove up to ski resorts in the winter, and needed a single vehicle that could support all of those different activities simultaneously. Does that sound like any vehicle segment that exists today? Because that is a perfect description of the demographic and use case for the people who currently buy Subaru Outbacks, Toyota RAV4s, Ford Escape hybrids, and every single crossover SUV that now completely dominates the American market. The vehicle segment that the Aztek was designed for did not actually exist in 2001. It exists now. We call them crossovers, and they are the single largest vehicle category in the United States by sales volume. Matthew DeBoard, writing for The Big Money in 2009, made exactly this case publicly. He compared the Aztek's commercial failure directly to Apple's Newton and the original Macintosh Portable. Both devices failed commercially in their own time. Both of them also invented product categories that later became the iPhone and the MacBook. The Aztek failed, DeBoard argued, simply because it was too early to survive in the market it was trying to create. Now look at what Pontiac actually built under the famously controversial sheet metal. The Aztek shares its platform with the Pontiac Montana, the Chevrolet Venture, the Oldsmobile Silhouette, and the Buick Rendezvous. Every single one of those vehicles is a minivan. Every one of them was built in huge numbers over long production runs. Every one of them runs proven, high-volume General Motors drivetrain components that had been tested in millions of vehicles before the Aztek ever reached dealers. The engine is the 3.4-liter LA1 V6, which is a pushrod design with an iron block and aluminum heads. It is not exciting. It is not particularly fuel efficient. It is, however, extremely durable, and the same basic engine was installed in more than 4 million General Motors vehicles during its full production life. The transmission is the 4-speed 4T65E automatic, which was the standard General Motors minivan transmission from 1997 through the mid-2000s. Millions of them were built, and they are famously forgiving of abuse. On the verified owner review platform, Edmunds, one owner has publicly documented 428,000 miles on a 2005 Aztek, running on the original engine, the original transmission, and with only a single alternator replacement along the way. That alternator was the only time the car ever stranded him. Another verified owner documented 380,000 kilometers on the same platform. The 2004 Aztek holds a 4.4 out of 5 owner reliability score on Cars.com, with 87% of owners saying they would actively recommend the vehicle to other buyers. Compare that to the most common reliability benchmark of the same era, which is the early 2000s Ford Explorer, a vehicle that is statistically far less reliable than the Aztek, has significantly less usable cargo capacity, and has never once appeared on a worst cars ever list, despite its genuinely concerning reliability record. The Aztek's reliability data is actually closer to the Toyota Highlander of the same vintage than to anything Ford was building on its midsize SUV platform at the time. And in perhaps the strangest postscript of all, clean low-mileage Azteks have started appreciating on the collector market over the past few years, with Bring a Trailer and Cars and Bids both having sold well-preserved examples for prices higher than the vehicles originally cost when new. Some of that is Breaking Bad cultural cachet, some of it is straightforward nostalgia, and some of it is the dawning recognition that the Aztek was genuinely attempting something interesting that nobody else was trying at the time. The body is ugly, the mechanicals are proven. Those are completely different things. Car number 4. The Volkswagen Jetta TDI. Volkswagen as a brand carries two separate reputations that both actively hurt it when shoppers look at used Jettas today. The first reputation is German complexity, unreliable electrics, expensive parts, coil packs, window regulators, control modules, and plastic clips that break in cold weather. Every single Volkswagen owner has a story about a strange warning light that took $800 to diagnose at the dealership. The second reputation is Dieselgate, In September of 2015, the Environmental Protection Agency discovered that Volkswagen had been installing software defeat devices in its TDI diesel engines for years. That software detected when the car was being emissions tested and ran a different engine map during the test than during normal street driving, which meant that real-world emissions were many times higher than the legal limits allowed. Volkswagen eventually paid more than $30 billion in settlements, fines, buybacks, and retrofits, and Dieselgate became the single biggest corporate fraud case in the entire history of the automotive industry. The Volkswagen Jetta TDI carries both of those reputations simultaneously. It is a Volkswagen, and it is a diesel. Both of those words independently trigger skepticism from any reasonable used car shopper. Now, separate the engine from the scandal because the two are not actually related in the way most people assume. The defeat device software was installed specifically on the EA189 Common Rail TDI engines built from 2009 onward. The engine that lived in the 1999 through 2006 Jetta TDI is a completely different generation of engine entirely. It is called the ALH. It is a 1.9-liter four-cylinder turbo diesel that was produced from 1998 through 2006. It predates Dieselgate by a full engine generation, and crucially, it uses a mechanical fuel injection pump rather than a common rail electronic system to deliver fuel. A mechanical injection pump is old technology by modern standards. It is also nearly indestructible in operation. There is no high-pressure electronic control unit to fail. There is no emissions-cheating architecture to trip over, and the engine is simple enough mechanically that it was able to meet the emission standards of its era, honestly, without requiring any software trickery in the first place. The ALH is, by the open consensus of the diesel mechanics who actually work on these engines for a living, one of the most reliable diesel engines ever sold in North America. Here is what owners and independent specialist mechanics have documented over the years on the ALH engine. Independent diesel shops that specialize in German engines have torn down ALH engines with 300,000 to 500,000 kilometers on their odometers for routine analysis. The reports across those teardowns are remarkably consistent. Minimal internal wear on the bottom end, bearings still measuring within factory specification after 2 decades of service, cylinder walls still showing the original crosshatch pattern from the factory hone operation. One well-documented example in the community crossed 720,000 kilometers on original internals. That is, 447,000 miles without a single major engine intervention. The Volkswagen TDI Club forums have been running continuously since the late 1990s, and they are full of documented owner stories of cars that have crossed 400,000 miles on their original engines. Some have crossed 500,000 miles. A few outliers have gone even further than that. For comparison, the average American passenger car today is scrapped at approximately 200,000 miles. The reliability benchmark of the same era as the ALH, which is the Toyota Camry 4-cylinder, is documented by its owners reaching 300 to 350,000 miles regularly, though relatively few Camry owners push significantly past that mark without major engine work. The ALH Jetta regularly beats the Camry on documented longevity, and it does so while simultaneously returning fuel economy figures the Camry cannot approach. On a properly maintained ALH Jetta, real-world fuel economy during steady highway driving consistently hits 48 to 55 miles per gallon. Owners running conservative speeds on flat ground have routinely documented fuel economy figures of over 60 miles per gallon on single tanks. That is hybrid territory from a 1999 model year sedan. For context, a Toyota Prius of the same era returned approximately 45 miles per gallon, combined on the EPA test cycle. The Jetta TDI was never marketed as a hybrid vehicle. It never carried a premium price tag for its efficiency, and it simply used a diesel engine and a tall final drive ratio to quietly beat the original Prius on the highway while outlasting almost everything else on the road in the process. There is also a small but dedicated community of TDI drag racers who have pushed modified ALH Jettas into the low 12-second range on the quarter mile, which is faster than a Ford Mustang GT of the same era. That is probably the least likely sleeper in modern Volkswagen history. Now, everything wrapped around that legendary engine is still a MK4 Volkswagen, and that reality cannot be avoided. The window regulators will fail. Various electrical components will fail over time. The interior door panel clips will break with enough heat cycles. The plastic cup holders will eventually crack. That is simply the ownership reality of an MK4 Volkswagen, and no amount of engine engineering can rescue the car from the interior and electrical issues that come standard with the platform. The TDI's one absolute non-negotiable maintenance requirement is the timing belt. On the ALH, the timing belt must be replaced at 100,000 miles without exception or negotiation, because a failed timing belt will destroy the engine completely. It is an interference design, which means that the moment the belt breaks, every piston in the engine will hit every valve simultaneously. The engine is finished in a single second of operation. Pay that 100,000-mile maintenance cost religiously. The engine will outlast the car that surrounds it. Car number 5, the Chrysler PT Cruiser. The Chrysler PT Cruiser is, to almost everyone who remembers it, nothing but a punchline. It is the rental car fleet vehicle, the retirement community vehicle, the vehicle your aunt bought new in 2003 and still drives to the grocery store today. Its retro styling aged from clever in 2001 to embarrassing by 2005 to culturally invisible by 2010. Internet commenters mock it reflexively in any car discussion. The phrase PT losers appeared in car forums within a year of the vehicle's original launch, and it has never entirely gone away since. And yet, when you actually look at the data, a very different picture emerges. The PT Cruiser was not a cynical product built to chase a trend. It was developed with genuine creative ambition. The development program began inside Chrysler in 1996, when Chrysler's vice president of product development at the time was a man named Tom Gale, and Gale assigned a 27-year-old designer named Brian Nesbitt to lead the project from the design side. Nesbitt's creative brief was to design what Gale personally called a retro-modern hot rod. The design was originally intended for the Plymouth brand, and the series of concept cars that eventually evolved into the PT Cruiser were all badged as Plymouths throughout most of their development cycle. The 1997 Plymouth Pronto. The 1999 Plymouth Pronto Cruiser, spelled with a Z instead of an S. The near-final concept that Nesbitt developed was originally going to be called the Plymouth PT Cruiser when it entered production. Then, at the very end of 1999, Chrysler made the corporate decision to discontinue the Plymouth brand entirely. The last Plymouth was built in 2001, and the PT Cruiser was moved over to the Chrysler brand at the last possible moment in its development timeline. That is the specific reason why the production car does not visually resemble any other Chrysler product of its era. The stylistic inspiration for the PT Cruiser was not invented from scratch by Nesbitt. It was drawn very deliberately from two specific cars in Chrysler's own corporate history. The first was the Chrysler Airflow from 1934, which was one of the most aerodynamically advanced American cars of its entire decade. A commercial failure in its own time despite its engineering, and a design that has been quietly influencing American stylists for 90 years since. The second reference point was the Chrysler and DeSoto Airflow of 1936. Both of those original cars had the bulldog stance, the flared fenders, and the tall greenhouse cabin that the PT Cruiser borrowed directly for its own production design. Brian Nesbitt, the 27-year-old designer who drew the PT Cruiser almost single-handedly, later moved over to General Motors to continue his career. He went on to design the 7th-generation Chevrolet Malibu. He designed the Chevrolet HHR, which is essentially a direct architectural follow-up to the PT Cruiser's design language. And he eventually became General Motors' Vice President of Design for North America, overseeing all design work for every GM brand sold in the region. The PT Cruiser was therefore the very first major production vehicle of a career that ended up running design for one of the largest automotive corporations in the entire world. It was not drawn by a committee of corporate designers. It was drawn by a single young designer who went on to shape one of the most influential design organizations in the industry. When the PT Cruiser finally went on sale in the spring of 2001, It was not a commercial failure at all. It was an absolute phenomenon. Chrysler set up waiting lists at dealerships across the entire country within the first few weeks of availability. The assembly factory in Toluca, Mexico, ran overtime shifts continuously for months to meet the overwhelming demand. In just its third year on the market, the PT Cruiser sold approximately 145,000 units in the United States alone, and roughly 190,000 units worldwide across all markets combined. Across the full production run from 2001 through 2010, Chrysler sold more than 1.3 million PT Cruisers globally. That is not a commercial failure by any honest measure. That is a genuine blockbuster. It simply happens to be a blockbuster that aged badly in the cultural conversation. And those are two fundamentally different stories. Here is the detail that almost no PT Cruiser owner actually knows about their own car. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration classifies the PT Cruiser as a light truck, not as a passenger car, as a truck. Chrysler engineered the PT Cruiser very specifically so that it would meet the NHTSA's official light truck definition under federal regulation. The NHTSA's rules at the time classified any vehicle as a truck if it had certain minimum cargo capacity, a minimum ground clearance, and specific seat removal features. By ensuring that the PT Cruiser's rear seats could be fully removed from the vehicle, that the cargo area met the volume threshold when the seats were out, and that the vehicle met the specific ground clearance criteria in the rulebook, Chrysler was able to reclassify the entire vehicle as a light truck under federal regulation. The reason they made that engineering effort actually matters quite a bit. The passenger car fuel economy standard at the time was significantly stricter than the light truck standard. By formally making the PT Cruiser a truck on federal paperwork, Chrysler lowered the average fuel economy its entire passenger car fleet needed to meet in order to stay compliant with CAFE regulations. The PT Cruiser, which visually looks like a 1930s gangster getaway vehicle, is therefore legally classified as a light truck. Its owners have been quietly driving trucks without knowing it for 25 years. Now look at what RepairPal has actually documented about PT Cruiser reliability over the years. PT Cruiser owners bring their vehicles in for unscheduled repair work an average of 0.2 times per year. The industry-wide compact car average for unscheduled repairs is 0.3 times per year. The all-vehicle average across every class of vehicle in the United States is 0.4 times per year. By the verified data, a PT Cruiser owner visits the mechanic for unscheduled repairs less often than the average Toyota Corolla owner of the exact same era. Consumer Reports historically rated the PT Cruiser's reliability as better than average for its segment. One owner on the Alpar Chrysler Community Forum documented 484,000 miles on his 2004 PT Cruiser, with only one transmission replacement and one single engine rebuild along the entire way. At nearly 500,000 miles of service, most of the original components on that car were still in place, including the original heater core, which the owner described as a genuinely brutal part to replace when it finally failed. The engine in the PT Cruiser is Chrysler's 2.4-liter EDZ 4-cylinder. It is a cast iron block with an aluminum head. The same basic engine architecture was tuned to produce 230 horsepower in the turbocharged Dodge Neon SRT4, which was a factory hot rod that Dodge actively marketed as a straight-line monster for young enthusiasts. If that engine block can survive dedicated boosted performance duty in a factory performance car, it can easily survive daily service in a retro-styled grocery hauler without ever breaking a sweat. Compare that directly to the most widely trusted reliability benchmark of the same era, which is the Toyota Camry. RepairPal shows the Camry of that same vintage at approximately 0.3 unscheduled repair visits per year, which means the PT Cruiser actually beats the Camry on documented reliability data. Not ties it, beats it. By the numbers. Reputation is simply a story that people tell. Stories can be wrong, and stories can stay wrong for a very long time without anyone seriously challenging them. Every single car featured in this video has a real weakness, and those weaknesses deserve to be acknowledged honestly. The tire pressures on the Corvair genuinely did matter to how the car drove, and General Motors should never have deleted that front sway bar to save $15 per unit. The rotary engine really does demand a careful and attentive owner who understands warm-up procedures. The Aztek really was visually ugly by any reasonable aesthetic standard. The MK4 Volkswagen really will annoy you with small plastic failures until you eventually stop noticing them. The PT Cruiser really did age badly in the court of public opinion. None of those honest weaknesses are what the reputations say, however. The reputations say those cars are fundamentally unreliable. The reputations say they were corporate mistakes. The reputations say the people who built them were not paying attention to the work, or did not care about the final product, or produced something beneath the standard of real automotive engineering. None of that is true when you actually look at what we just walked through together. A car designed by an engineer who built tanks in the Second World War before designing one of the most influential American V8 engines ever produced. An engine built by 47 Japanese engineers who solved a problem that financially bankrupted a German manufacturer, trying to crack the same challenge. A crossover designed by a man who would go on to draw the Corvette C7 before being systematically destroyed by a design review committee inside his own company. A diesel built with such fundamentally sound engineering that it routinely outlasts the car it is bolted into by hundreds of thousands of miles. A retro-styled light truck, and it is technically a light truck by federal classification, designed by a 27-year-old designer who became the head of design for General Motors. These are not accidents. These are not corporate failures. These are cars that were misunderstood in their own time, and that have never been given the genuine second look they deserve from the buying public. The next time you hear a dismissive comment about a used car that someone is seriously thinking of buying, ask where the reputation actually came from in the first place. Ask when that reputation was originally formed. Ask whether the specific engineering it was attacking is even still present in the vehicle being discussed today. Because in the car world, the thing that gets repeated most often is rarely the thing that is actually true. The thing that is actually true is sitting quietly in the data. It is sitting in the race records at Le Mans. It is sitting in the odometer readings of owners who never bothered to post on any internet forum. It is sitting in the quiet evidence of cars that kept running reliably long after the cultural conversation about them moved on to something newer. That evidence is worth more than any car review ever written. Now, click on this next video to find out why Toyota built one of the most over-engineered sedans of the 1980s, spent a decade positioning it as the future of the brand in America, and then quietly killed it overnight when a new nameplate arrived to take its place.